Lieutenant Sarah Chen had always despised the sound of aircraft engines. The deep, rumbling roar that others found comforting reminded her only of failure, of dreams that had been crushed under the weight of bureaucracy and prejudice. As she walked across the tarmac at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, the familiar drone of a C-130 Hercules transport overhead made her jaw clench involuntarily. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 5 years ago, she had been Captain Sarah Chen, one of the most promising pilots in the Air Force Academy. She could thread a needle with a fighter jet, execute barrel rolls that made seasoned instructors weep with envy, and land anything with wings in conditions that would ground most aircraft. Her call sign had been Phoenix, earned after she'd successfully brought home a damaged F-16 with one engine and no hydraulics during a training exercise that should have ended in ejection. But that was before the incident, before the investigation, before the court-martial that had stripped her of her wings and left her with a choice between military, prison, and accepting a complete career change. The Air Force had offered her a lifeline of sorts, a chance to remain in service if she agreed to retrain as a flight nurse. They needed medical personnel who understood aviation, they said. Someone who could provide critical care during medical evacuations, while understanding the unique challenges of in-flight emergencies. What they really meant was that they needed a scapegoat who would disappear quietly into the ranks of the medical corps, far from the cockpits where she truly belonged. Sarah had taken the deal because the alternative was losing everything she'd worked for since childhood. But every day in her nursing uniform felt like wearing a costume, playing a role that diminished who she really was. Now, as she approached the medical facility where she'd spent the last 5 years of her life, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the window of a nearby hangar. The woman staring back wore the crisp blue uniform of an Air Force nurse, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her expression carefully neutral. But her eyes still held the fire of someone who belonged in the sky, not tethered to the ground by circumstances beyond her control. The medical evacuation unit, where Sarah worked, was considered one of the best in the European theater. They specialized in transporting critically wounded soldiers from combat zones back to advanced medical facilities, often under conditions that tested both aircraft and crew to their limits. As the senior flight nurse, Sarah had earned the respect of her colleagues through her calm competence and uncanny ability to keep patients stable during the most turbulent flights. What her colleagues didn't know was that Sarah spent her off-duty hours in the base flight simulator, maintaining her piloting skills through a combination of legitimate training programs and carefully orchestrated favors from sympathetic instructors. She told herself it was just a way to stay sharp, to maintain a connection to the life she'd lost. But deep down, she knew she was preparing for something, though she couldn't say what. The morning that would change everything began like any other. Sarah was reviewing patient files in the medical unit's briefing room when the alert klaxon began its urgent wail. Emergency evacuation missions were routine, but something about this particular alarm felt different. More urgent, more desperate. Major Rebecca Torres, the unit's commanding officer, burst through the doors with an expression Sarah had never seen before. Torres was a veteran of 3 combat deployments, a woman who maintained her composure under pressure that would break most people. But today, her face was pale, her movements sharp with barely controlled panic. "We have a priority Alpha evacuation," Torres announced to the assembled medical team. "Multiple casualties from a forward operating base that's under siege. The enemy has advanced anti-aircraft capabilities, and we're looking at a hot extraction under fire." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Priority Alpha missions were reserved for the most critical situations, usually involving high-value personnel or circumstances that could affect the broader mission. The fact that they were attempting an extraction under active fire meant someone Very important was bleeding out in a combat zone. Flight crew? Asked Lieutenant Marcus Webb, one of the junior nurses who joined the unit 6 months earlier. Torres hesitated for a fraction of a second, and Sarah caught the flash of uncertainty in her eyes. Colonel Harrison and Captain Rodriguez. They're our best crew for this type of mission. Sarah knew both men by reputation. Colonel James Harrison was a legend in transport aviation, a pilot who'd flown everything from cargo runs to special operations insertions across 4 decades of service. Captain Miguel Rodriguez was younger but equally skilled, a former fighter pilot who'd transitioned to transport aircraft after an injury had grounded him from combat missions. Together, they formed one of the most experienced and capable flight crews in the entire command. But something in Torres's voice suggested all was not well with the assignment. Sarah had learned to read the subtle signs of military politics over her years of service, and she sensed undercurrents of tension that went beyond the normal stress of a dangerous mission. The briefing continued with technical details about the target location, a remote outpost in the mountains of Afghanistan where American forces had been conducting reconnaissance operations. Intelligence suggested that Taliban forces had surrounded the base and were using advanced weapon systems to prevent any aircraft from approaching. Several previous extraction attempts had been forced to abort after taking heavy fire. The weather is marginal, Torres continued, with low visibility and high winds. The landing zone is barely adequate for a C-130, and we'll have minimal time on the ground before enemy forces can adjust their fire. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah studied the mission parameters on the briefing screen, her pilot's instincts automatically calculating approach angles, risk factors, and potential complications. The landing zone was a nightmare, essentially a dirt strip carved into a mountainside with barely enough room for an aircraft the size of a Hercules. The weather conditions would make instrument approaches nearly impossible, and the enemy threat meant they'd have to come in fast and low, with minimal margin for error. It was exactly the kind of mission that separated exceptional pilots from merely good ones. The kind of flying that required not just technical skill, but the intuitive understanding of aircraft performance that came from years of experience pushing machines to their absolute limits. Sarah found herself unconsciously running through the mental checklist she'd use for such an approach, calculating fuel consumption and wind drift with the automatic precision of someone who'd spent thousands of hours in cockpits. Medical team will consist of 4 personnel, Torres announced, pulling Sarah back to the present. Senior Flight Nurse Chen will lead, with Webb, Kowalski, and Martinez providing support. We're anticipating multiple trauma cases, potentially, including combat casualties with complex injuries. The mention of her name sent a familiar surge of adrenaline through Sarah's system. This was what she'd trained for, the reason the Air Force had invested in her medical education, despite her controversial past. She was uniquely qualified to provide critical care in the demanding environment of military aviation, combining her understanding of flight operations with advanced trauma medicine. But as the briefing concluded and the team began their pre-mission preparations, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The details they'd been given seemed incomplete, the intelligence reports too vague for such a high-risk operation. In her experience, successful missions required thorough planning and comprehensive information. This felt rushed, almost improvised. An hour later, as Sarah and her team loaded their medical equipment onto the C-130, she caught sight of Colonel Harrison and Captain Rodriguez conducting their pre-flight inspection. Both men moved with the confident efficiency of experienced aviators, but Sarah noticed subtle signs of tension in their body language. Harrison's usual easy smile was absent, replaced by a grim expression that suggested he understood more about this mission than he'd shared with the medical team. Rodriguez appeared even more troubled, repeatedly checking systems that Sarah knew. He'd already verified multiple times. As a former pilot herself, she recognized the behavior of someone who suspected their aircraft might be facing challenges beyond the normal parameters of military aviation. The C-130 Hercules that would carry them into harm's way was a testament to American engineering excellence. The four-engine turboprop had been the workhorse of military aviation for over half a century, capable of landing on rough strips that would be impossible for larger aircraft. This particular bird, tail number 7841, had been modified specifically for medical evacuation missions, with specialized equipment for patient care and life support systems that could function independently of ground power. Sarah had flown in 7,841 dozens of times over the past 5 years, and she knew every sound, every vibration, every quirk of its performance characteristics. The aircraft had never failed to bring her home safely, but she'd also never taken it into a situation as dangerous as what they were facing today. As the medical team secured their equipment and prepared for departure, Sarah found herself studying the cockpit area with more than casual interest. The instrument panel was a mix of traditional analog gauges and modern digital displays, representing decades of technological evolution. She could see Harrison and Rodriguez working through their pre-flight checklists with methodical precision, their movements synchronized by years of working together as a crew. But something in Rodriguez's posture caught her attention. The younger pilot was favoring his left side slightly, a subtle indication that might mean nothing or might suggest he was dealing with some form of physical discomfort. Sarah's medical training automatically cataloged the observation, even as her pilot's instincts wondered if Rodriguez was fully capable of handling the demanding flying they were about to attempt. The thought troubled her more than she wanted to admit. Rodriguez's reputation was based on his ability to fly with pinpoint precision under pressure, but even the best pilots could be compromised by factors beyond their control. Pain, medication, fatigue, or personal stress could all affect performance in ways that might not be apparent until the most critical moments of a mission. The engines of the C-130 roared to life with their characteristic whine, building to the steady rumble that would carry them across half of Europe and into the mountains of Afghanistan. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of acceleration as Harrison applied power for takeoff, the aircraft responding with the reliable predictability that had made the Hercules a legend in military aviation. As they climbed through the clouds over Germany, Sarah settled into the routine of flight operations that had become second nature over her years as a flight nurse. She checked and rechecked her medical equipment, reviewed the patient files they'd been given, and mentally prepared for the challenges that awaited them at their destination. But her eyes kept drifting toward the cockpit, where she could see Harrison and Rodriguez maintaining their professional demeanor, despite what she sensed was growing tension between them. Their radio communications were crisp and efficient, but Sarah detected undercurrents of disagreement in their clipped exchanges. 3 hours into the flight, as they crossed into the airspace over the Mediterranean, Sarah noticed Rodriguez reach for what appeared to be medication from his flight bag. The movement was quick and discreet, but her medical training had taught her to observe such details automatically. Whatever Rodriguez was taking, he was trying to hide it from his fellow crew members. The realization sent a chill through Sarah's system. Military aviation regulations were explicit about medication use during flight operations. Even over-the-counter drugs could be grounds for grounding a pilot if they might affect performance or judgment. The fact that Rodriguez was self-medicating during a critical mission suggested either poor judgment or a medical condition serious enough to warrant significant risk. Sarah found herself facing an ethical dilemma that cut to the heart of her. Dual identity as both a nurse and a former pilot. Her medical training demanded that she report any concerns about crew fitness, but her understanding of aviation culture knew that such a report could destroy Rodriguez's career, even if his condition proved minor. More immediately, she had to consider whether Rodriguez's condition might compromise the mission itself. They were heading into one of the most dangerous aviation environments imaginable, where split-second decisions and precise aircraft control could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. If Rodriguez was impaired in any way, he was putting not just himself at risk, but the entire crew and the wounded soldiers they were trying to save. The dilemma was complicated by Sarah's own complicated history with military aviation. Her fall from grace had begun with questions about judgment and adherence to regulations, issues that had ultimately cost her everything she'd worked to achieve. She understood better than most how quickly a promising career could be destroyed by circumstances that seemed minor until they converged into catastrophe. But she also understood the weight of responsibility that came with flying military aircraft. In combat situations, every decision carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate crew, affecting families, units, and missions that depended on successful completion of operations like the one they were currently flying. As the C-130 continued its journey eastward, Sarah found herself caught between competing loyalties and conflicting responsibilities. She could report her concerns about Rodriguez and potentially prevent a disaster, but doing so would require her to betray the trust of a fellow aviator, based on nothing more than observation and suspicion. Alternatively, she could remain silent and hope that whatever was affecting Rodriguez would not compromise his ability to fly when it mattered most. But if she was wrong, if his condition proved serious enough to affect the mission, her silence could contribute to a tragedy that might have been prevented. The hours passed with agonizing slowness as Sarah wrestled with her decision. The C-130 crossed from European airspace into the Middle East, then began its approach to the refueling stop that would prepare them for the final leg of their journey into Afghanistan. Each mile brought them closer to the moment when Rodriguez's fitness would be tested under the most demanding conditions possible. During the refueling stop, Sarah made a decision that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. Rather than reporting her concerns through official channels, she chose to approach Rodriguez directly, hoping to assess his condition without triggering the bureaucratic machinery that could ground the mission entirely. She found him in the crew rest area, reviewing approach charts for their destination airfield. Up close, she could see the subtle signs of distress that had caught her attention earlier. His skin was slightly pale, with a thin sheen of perspiration that suggested either pain or nausea. His movements were careful and deliberate, as if he was concentrating on appearing normal despite some underlying discomfort. "Captain Rodriguez," Sarah said quietly, settling into the seat beside him. "How are you feeling?" Rodriguez looked up from his charts with an expression that combined surprise and wariness. "Fine, Lieutenant." "Why do you ask?" "I'm a nurse," Sarah replied simply. "It's my job to notice when people aren't feeling well. And you don't look fine." For a moment, Rodriguez seemed to consider denying any problems. But something in Sarah's demeanor, perhaps the understanding that came from her own experience with career-threatening situations, prompted him to tell the truth. "Kidney stones," he admitted quietly, "started last night. I'm managing the pain with medication, but it's been challenging." Sarah felt her heart sink. Kidney stones could cause excruciating pain that came in waves, often accompanied by nausea and difficulty concentrating. Even with medication, Rodriguez would be fighting a battle against his own body throughout the demanding flight they were about to attempt. "Have you told Colonel Harrison?" she asked. Rodriguez shook his head. "This mission is too important. There are soldiers dying while we sit here talking. I can handle the pain long enough to get them home." Sarah understood the sentiment, even as her medical training screamed warnings about the dangers of flying while impaired. Rodriguez was thinking like a soldier, prioritizing the mission and the lives of fellow service members over his own comfort and safety. But good intentions couldn't overcome physiological limitations, And kidney stone pain was notorious for its ability to incapacitate even the strongest individuals. "Captain," Sarah said carefully, "I need you to understand the medical implications of what you're dealing with. Kidney stone pain can spike without warning, causing temporary incapacitation. Even with medication, you could find yourself unable to function at a critical moment." Rodriguez met her eyes with a look of grim determination. "Then I'll have to make sure that doesn't happen." "That's not how medicine works," Sarah replied. "Pain at this level affects cognitive function, reaction time, and decision-making ability. You might not even realize you're impaired until it's too late." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Harrison, who appeared in the crew rest area with the focused energy of someone preparing for a challenging mission. His expression suggested he was already mentally rehearsing the complex procedures they would need to execute in order to successfully complete their extraction. "Rodriguez," Harrison said, "I want to go over the approach procedures one more time. The latest intelligence suggests the enemy has moved additional anti-aircraft assets into the area." Sarah watched as Rodriguez immediately shifted into his professional mode, hiding any sign of discomfort as he engaged with his aircraft commander. But she could see the cost of maintaining that facade in the tight lines around his eyes and the careful way he moved to avoid jarring his injured side. As the two pilots reviewed their mission planning, Sarah found herself facing a decision that would define not just the immediate future, but potentially the rest of her career. She could intervene now, reporting Rodriguez's condition and forcing Harrison to either scrub the mission or find a replacement pilot. Such a decision would be medically sound and professionally defensible, but it would also mean abandoning the soldiers who were counting on their arrival. Alternatively, she could remain silent and hope that Rodriguez's determination would be enough to overcome his physical limitations. But if she was wrong, if his condition compromised the mission at a critical moment, the consequences could be catastrophic for everyone involved. The weight of the decision pressed down on Sarah like a physical force. In her former life as a pilot, she would have been the one making such choices, balancing risk against necessity in the split-second calculations that defined military aviation. Now relegated to the role of observer, she could only watch as others made decisions that would determine whether they all returned home safely. As Harrison and Rodriguez completed their planning session and prepared to return to the cockpit, Sarah made a choice that reflected her unique understanding of both aviation and medicine. She would monitor Rodriguez closely throughout the remainder of the flight, prepared to intervene if his condition deteriorated beyond safe limits. It was a compromise that satisfied neither her medical training nor her aviator's instincts, but it was the best solution she could devise under the circumstances. The final leg of their journey took them across the rugged terrain of Afghanistan, where the landscape below told the story of decades of conflict. Sarah could see the scars left by years of warfare, the abandoned villages and cratered roads that marked the passage of armies through these ancient mountains. As they approached their destination, the radio chatter increased with reports from ground controllers and intelligence updates about enemy activity in the area. The situation at the forward operating base had deteriorated since their departure, with Taliban forces tightening their siege and bringing additional weapons to bear on any aircraft that attempted to land. Harrison's voice came over the intercom with the calm professionalism that marked experienced military pilots. "We're beginning our descent. Medical team, prepare for a hot extraction. We'll be on the ground for no more than 5 minutes." Sarah felt the familiar sensation of the aircraft beginning its descent, the engines changing pitch as Harrison reduced power and began the complex approach that would take them into one of the most dangerous landing zones in the current theater of operations. Through the small windows of the cargo compartment, she could see the mountainous terrain rising around them, a maze of peaks and valleys that offered countless hiding places for enemy forces. The approach to the forward operating base required precise navigation through mountain passes that left little room for error. Harrison had to balance the need for speed, which would minimize their exposure to enemy fire, against the requirement for precision, which was essential for landing safely on the marginal airstrip that awaited them. As the C-130 descended through the mountain passes, Sarah could feel the aircraft responding to turbulence and wind shear that made smooth flight impossible. The Hercules bucked and rolled like a living thing, its 4 engines working hard to maintain stable flight in the challenging conditions. From her position in the cargo compartment, Sarah could see into the cockpit where Harrison and Rodriguez were fighting to control their aircraft through the demanding approach. Harrison's movements were steady and confident, the product of decades of experience in challenging conditions. But Rodriguez was showing signs of strain that went beyond the normal stress of difficult flying. His movements had become slightly jerky, lacking the fluid precision that marked skilled pilots. Several times, Sarah saw him pause in the middle of completing a checklist item, as if he was fighting through waves of pain that disrupted his concentration. Most concerning, she noticed him gripping the control yoke with white-knuckled intensity, suggesting he was using physical tension to compensate for diminished focus. The radio crackled with urgent transmissions from the ground controller at their destination. Dustoff 741, be advised we are taking mortar fire on the eastern perimeter. Enemy forces are attempting to adjust fire on the landing zone. Harrison's response was calm and professional. Copy ground control. We're committed to the approach. Have your casualties ready for immediate loading. As they descended through the final 1,000 feet of altitude, Sarah could see tracer fire rising from positions around the besieged outpost. The enemy was clearly aware of their approach and was attempting to bring weapons to bear on the landing zone. Bright flashes on the mountainsides marked the positions of hostile forces, while return fire from American positions created a deadly light show in the gathering dusk. The landing zone itself was exactly as challenging as Sarah had expected. A dirt strip carved into the side of a mountain, barely long enough for a C-130 and surrounded by terrain that offered no margin for error. Harrison would have to execute a precision approach that brought them down at exactly the right angle and speed, with no opportunity for a second attempt if he got it wrong. As the aircraft lined up for its final approach, Sarah felt her pilot's instincts taking over despite her position as a passenger. She could sense the aircraft's energy state, the balance between speed and altitude that would determine whether they could land safely on the short strip ahead. Harrison was flying with the skill of a master aviator, but the margin for error was essentially zero. Then, just as they crossed the threshold of the landing zone, Rodriguez doubled over in his seat with a cry of pain that Sarah could hear even over the engine noise. His hands flew to his side as another wave of kidney stone pain crashed over him, leaving him temporarily incapacitated at the most critical moment of the approach. Harrison immediately took full control of the aircraft, his years of experience, allowing him to compensate for the sudden loss of his co-pilot. But the additional workload came at a moment when his attention was already fully occupied with the demanding requirements of the landing. Sarah could see him struggling to manage both his own controls and the systems that Rodriguez should have been monitoring. The C-130 touched down hard on the dirt strip, its landing gear absorbing the impact as Harrison fought to maintain directional control. The aircraft bounced once, then settled onto the rough surface with a grinding rumble that spoke of metal and machinery being pushed to their limits. As they rolled to a stop at the end of the strip, Sarah was already moving toward the cargo door. The wounded soldiers they had come to save were waiting in the darkness beyond, and every second on the ground increased their exposure to enemy fire. But even as she prepared to do her job as a flight nurse, her mind was racing with the implications of what she had just witnessed. Rodriguez was clearly unable to continue functioning as a co-pilot, which meant Harrison would have to fly the return journey without assistance. The prospect of attempting a takeoff from this marginal airstrip While managing all aircraft systems alone was daunting even for a pilot of Harrison's caliber. But as Sarah looked toward the cockpit, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Harrison was slumped forward in his seat, his face pale and his breathing labored. Even as she watched, he reached for his chest with a grimace of pain that she recognized immediately from her medical training. Colonel Harrison, the master aviator who was supposed to get them all home safely, was having a heart attack. Sarah's mind went completely still for a moment as the full implications of their situation crashed over her like a physical blow. They were on the ground in a combat zone under active enemy fire, with both pilots incapacitated and a cargo compartment that would soon be filled with critically wounded soldiers. The nearest alternative landing site was hundreds of miles away, far beyond the range they could travel without someone capable of flying the aircraft. But even as panic threatened to overwhelm her rational thought, Sarah's training kicked in. With automatic precision, she was a nurse first, responsible for the medical care of everyone on the aircraft. Harrison's condition required immediate attention if he was going to survive, much less fly them home. She moved quickly toward the cockpit, calling over her shoulder to her medical team. Webb, take charge of the casualty loading. Martinez and Kowalski, prepare for cardiac emergency. We have a pilot down. As she reached Harrison's position, Sarah could see the classic signs of a myocardial infarction. His skin was gray and clammy, his breathing shallow and rapid. His left arm was pressed against his chest, and his eyes showed the confusion and fear that often accompanied cardiac events. "Colonel," Sarah said firmly, placing her hand on his shoulder to get his attention, "I need you to listen to me. You're having a heart attack, and I'm going to treat you. But first, I need to know, can you fly this aircraft?" Harrison's response was barely a whisper. Can't breathe. Chest feels like it's crushing." Sarah felt her heart sink, even as her medical training took over. Harrison was in no condition to fly, and even if his condition stabilized, the medications required to treat a heart attack would ground him for weeks if not permanently. They were effectively stranded on a mountain airstrip with enemy forces closing in and no one qualified to get them home. The sound of incoming mortar rounds exploding nearby emphasized the urgency of their situation. Sarah could hear the American ground forces returning fire, but she knew their defensive perimeter wouldn't hold indefinitely. If they didn't get airborne soon, they would all be overrun by Taliban forces who showed no mercy to captured Americans. As her medical team worked to stabilize Harrison's condition, Sarah found herself staring at the aircraft controls that represented their only hope of survival. The instruments and switches that had once been as familiar as her own reflection now seemed like artifacts from another life, reminders of skills and knowledge that she was no longer supposed to possess. But circumstances had a way of stripping away artificial boundaries and revealing fundamental truths. Sarah Chen might officially be just a nurse, but she had been born to fly. Every instinct, every piece of training, every hour of experience she had accumulated over years of aviation was screaming at her to take control of the situation. The wounded soldiers who were being loaded into the cargo compartment deserved better than dying on a mountain, because bureaucratic politics had kept a qualified pilot out of the cockpit. Harrison deserved better than cardiac arrest being his final contribution to a military career spanning 4 decades. Rodriguez deserved better than being remembered for the mission where kidney stones prevented him from doing his job. And Sarah deserved better than spending the rest of her life knowing she had let everyone die because she was afraid to challenge the authorities who had stripped her of her wings. As enemy fire continued to impact around their position and her medical team fought to keep Harrison alive, Sarah made a decision that would either save them all or add her name to the list of military personnel who had died trying to do the impossible. She was going to fly them home. The first challenge was getting Harrison out of the pilot's seat without compromising the medical care he needed to survive. Sarah coordinated with her team to carefully move him to a stretcher in the cargo compartment, where they could continue cardiac monitoring and medication administration while she took over aircraft control. Rodriguez was in better shape medically, but remained incapacitated by pain. Sarah helped him to a crew rest position where he could receive pain medication without interfering with flight operations. He protested weakly about abandoning his duties, but his condition made it clear that he would be unable to assist with the complex procedures required for takeoff and flight. As Sarah settled into the pilot's seat that she had been denied for 5 years, she felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration that threatened to overwhelm her rational thought. The controls felt exactly as she remembered, the same arrangement of switches and gauges that had been second nature during her years as an active pilot. But this was not a training exercise or a routine transport mission. She was about to attempt to take off from a marginal airstrip while under enemy fire, with an aircraft loaded beyond normal limits and no co-pilot to assist with the complex procedures required for safe flight. The radio crackled with urgent transmissions. From the ground controller, "Dust off 741, you need to get airborne immediately. Enemy forces are massing for a ground assault on our position." Sarah keyed the microphone with hands that trembled slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. "Ground control, this is 741. We have medical emergencies on board and are preparing for immediate departure." "Roger, 741. Be advised the landing zone is taking indirect fire. We cannot guarantee clear airspace for departure." The implications were clear. Sarah would have to execute a combat takeoff under conditions that challenged even the most experienced military aviators. She would need to get the heavily loaded C-130 airborne from a dirt strip that barely met minimum requirements, while enemy forces attempted to shoot them down with everything from small arms fire to sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons. As she began the engine start procedures that would commit them to their course of action, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical force. Everyone on the aircraft, from the wounded soldiers in the cargo compartment to her own medical team, was depending on her ability to fly them to safety. The 4 turboprop engines of the C-130 roared to life with their characteristic whine, building to the steady rumble that had carried countless military missions across 6 decades of service. Sarah felt the aircraft responding to her control inputs, the familiar sensation of machine and pilot becoming one integrated system. But as she prepared for takeoff, she realized that her greatest challenge wasn't technical or tactical. It was psychological. 5 years of being told she wasn't qualified to fly. 5 years of watching other people make the decisions that she should have been making. 5 years of wondering if maybe the authorities were right about her judgment and abilities. Now with lives hanging in the balance and no other options available, Sarah had to rediscover the confidence that had once made her one of the most promising pilots in the Air Force. She had to trust in skills that had been dormant for years and make decisions that could save everyone or get them all killed. As she advanced the throttles and felt the C-130 begin its takeoff roll, Sarah whispered a prayer that encompassed everything she hoped for and everything she feared. In the next few minutes, she would either prove that she deserved to be called a pilot, or she would provide a final demonstration of why her wings had been taken away. The aircraft accelerated down the rough strip with agonizing slowness, its heavy load of fuel, equipment, and passengers making every foot of runway precious. Sarah could feel enemy rounds impacting near the aircraft, see tracer fire crossing ahead of their path. The end of the runway was approaching fast, and she wasn't sure they had enough speed for a safe takeoff. In that moment, suspended between earth and sky with death closing in from all sides, Sarah Chen remembered who she really was. Not just a nurse who happened to have aviation training, but a pilot who had chosen to serve in whatever capacity was needed. And pilots, above all else, found a way to bring their people home. The C-130 Hercules lifted off from the mountain airstrip with barely 20 feet of runway to spare, its overloaded frame shuddering as Sarah fought to maintain control in the thin air and turbulent crosswinds. Enemy muzzle flashes erupted from the ridgelines on both sides of the valley, tracer rounds creating deadly streams of light that crisscrossed the sky around them. Sarah's hands moved across the controls with muscle memory that transcended the 5-year gap since she'd last flown operationally. The aircraft responded sluggishly to her inputs, weighed down by fuel, medical equipment, and the wounded soldiers who filled every available space in the cargo compartment. Every control movement had to be deliberate and precise, with no margin for the kind of aggressive maneuvering that might shake off enemy targeting. Through her headset, she could hear the frantic radio chatter from the ground controller as American forces fought to maintain their defensive perimeter. The Taliban assault was intensifying, with mortar and rocket-propelled grenades raining down on the forward operating base they had just escaped. The window for extraction had closed permanently. Behind them, leaving no option but to make this desperate flight work. Behind her in the cargo compartment, Lieutenant Webb was fighting to keep Colonel Harrison alive, while simultaneously managing the care of 6 critically wounded soldiers. The combination of cardiac medications and the stress of high altitude flight created a dangerous cocktail that could prove fatal if not carefully monitored. Martinez and Kowalski were working with professional efficiency, but Sarah could hear the tension in their voices as they dealt with medical emergencies that would challenge any trauma center, much less an aircraft flying through hostile airspace. Captain Rodriguez remained conscious but incapacitated, his face gray with pain despite the morphine Webb had administered. He'd insisted on being moved to a position where he could observe the cockpit, determined to provide whatever assistance he could despite his condition. Sarah appreciated his presence, even though she knew he was in no shape to actually help with flight operations. The immediate challenge was gaining enough altitude to clear the mountain peaks that surrounded their departure airfield. The C-130's climb performance was marginal under the best of circumstances, and their current weight and density altitude created conditions that pushed the aircraft to its absolute limits. Sarah watched the altimeter creep upward with agonizing slowness, each 100 feet of altitude representing precious margin above the terrain that could kill them all. Anti-aircraft fire continued to reach toward them from multiple positions, the Taliban forces having clearly prepared for exactly this type of evacuation attempt. Sarah could see the bright flashes of surface-to-air missiles being launched from concealed positions, their heat-seeking warheads programmed to destroy any aircraft attempting to escape the valley. The threat warning system screamed its electronic alarm as missile guidance radars locked onto their aircraft. Sarah immediately began evasive maneuvers, throwing the heavy transport into turns and climbs that stressed both the airframe and the medical equipment secured in the cargo bay. She could hear equipment shifting and medical personnel calling out warnings as the aircraft's violent movements threatened to undo their careful preparations. Behind her, Harrison's cardiac monitor emitted the irregular beeping that indicated his heart rhythm was becoming increasingly unstable. The combination of altitude, stress, and medication was creating exactly the kind of physiological crisis that Sarah had feared. Webb's voice cut through the chaos with professional calm as he called out vital signs and medication requirements. But Sarah could hear the underlying tension that suggested Harrison's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The first missile passed close enough that Sarah could see its exhaust trail through the cockpit windows, a reminder of how close they had come to catastrophic failure. The second missile lost lock when she dove the aircraft toward a ridgeline, using the terrain to break the guidance signal at the cost of precious altitude that would have to be regained through laborious climbing. As they finally cleared the immediate threat zone around the forward operating base, Sarah allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. They were airborne, alive, and heading toward friendly airspace. But the celebration was premature, as Rodriguez's Weak voice over the intercom brought new concerns to her attention. "Sarah," he said, using her first name in violation of military protocol, but reflecting the intimacy of their shared crisis, "we have a problem with the fuel system. The evasive maneuvers damaged something in the left wing." Sarah's eyes immediately went to the fuel quantity indicators, where she could see confirmation of Rodriguez's observation. Fuel was streaming from the left wing at a rate that would make their planned destination unreachable. The anti-aircraft fire that had seemed like their primary threat was now revealed to have been merely the opening act of a much larger crisis. The mathematics of aviation fuel consumption were unforgiving. The C-130 carried enough fuel for their planned mission profile with standard reserves, but the loss of hundreds of gallons through combat damage had fundamentally altered their situation. Sarah quickly calculated their remaining range against potential diversion airfields, looking for options that might allow them to reach safety before the engines quit. The nearest friendly airfield was still 300 miles away, across some of the most hostile territory in Afghanistan. Enemy forces controlled much of the intervening airspace, and several of the potential emergency landing sites were either damaged or under Taliban control. Sarah found herself facing the kind of tactical decision that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones, balancing multiple competing factors under time pressure that allowed no room for indecision. Rodriguez struggled to assist with the fuel calculations despite his condition, his pilot training overriding the pain medication that clouded his thinking. Together, they determined that their best option was a damaged airstrip at Bagram Air Base, assuming they could maintain their current fuel consumption rate and avoid further combat damage. But even as they settled on a destination, new complications emerged from the cargo compartment. Webb's voice carried a note of controlled panic as he reported that one of the wounded soldiers was going into cardiac arrest, requiring immediate intervention that would demand his full attention. Martinez was dealing with a sucking chest wound that required constant pressure to prevent pneumothorax, while Kowalski was managing a soldier with massive blood loss who needed continuous fluid replacement. The combination of medical emergencies and flight emergencies created a perfect storm of competing demands that threatened to overwhelm everyone's ability to respond effectively. Sarah found herself flying the aircraft while simultaneously serving as the senior medical authority for decisions that could mean life or death for multiple patients. Harrison's condition continued to deteriorate, his blood pressure dropping. Despite aggressive medication, the high altitude and stress of their situation were proving too much for his damaged cardiovascular system, creating a medical emergency that demanded immediate attention, even as Sarah struggled to keep them all alive through skilled flying. The radio crackled with transmissions from various control agencies as word of their situation spread through the military communication network. Air traffic controllers were scrambling to clear airspace for their emergency approach, while fighter aircraft were being vectored to provide escort through the most dangerous portions of their route. But fighter escorts could only do so much against the kind of threats they were facing. Taliban forces had learned to adapt their tactics to counter American air superiority, using mobile surface-to-air missile systems that could disappear into the landscape after launching their deadly cargo. The fact that Sarah was flying a slow, predictable transport aircraft made her an ideal target for weapon systems designed to counter exactly this type of mission. As they crossed into the next phase of their flight, Sarah realized that their fuel situation was becoming even more critical than initially calculated. The damage to their left wing was apparently more extensive than Rodriguez had first assessed, with fuel consumption rates that would leave them with minimal reserves by the time they reached Bagram. The prospect of arriving at their destination with empty fuel tanks added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Sarah would have to execute a precision approach and landing with no opportunity for a second attempt. While managing multiple medical emergencies and potentially dealing with mechanical failures caused by fuel starvation, Rodriguez made a heroic effort to assist with navigation and communication despite his incapacitation, his voice weak but determined as he coordinated with air traffic control and provided Sarah with critical information about their destination airfield. His knowledge of Bagram's approach procedures and emergency protocols proved invaluable as they prepared for what would likely be the most challenging landing of Sarah's career. The wounded soldiers in the cargo compartment represented not just medical cases but individual human beings whose survival depended entirely on Sarah's ability to get them to advanced medical care. She could hear their labored breathing, their occasional cries of pain, the quiet conversations between medical personnel fighting to keep them alive. Each voice was a reminder of the responsibility she carried, the weight of decisions that would determine whether families received their loved ones back alive or in flag-draped coffins. Webb's status reports painted a grim picture of Harrison's condition. The combination of altitude, stress, and cardiac medication was creating a downward spiral that threatened to become irreversible without immediate intervention. Harrison needed a cardiac catheterization lab and surgical support that could only be provided at a major medical facility, making their race against time even more desperate. As they approached the halfway point of their journey, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in the aircraft's handling, characteristics that suggested additional problems beyond the fuel leak. The C-130 was pulling slightly to the left, indicating possible damage to the control surfaces or landing gear systems. Every system on the aircraft had been stressed beyond normal limits by their combat takeoff and evasive maneuvers, creating the potential for cascading failures that could prove catastrophic. The threat warning system continued to sound intermittent. Alarms as various radar systems painted their aircraft, some friendly and some decidedly hostile. Sarah had to make continuous decisions about which threats required immediate evasive action and which could be ignored, balancing the need for defensive maneuvering against the medical requirements of her patients and the fuel conservation necessary for reaching their destination. Rodriguez provided invaluable assistance with threat assessment despite his condition, his experience with combat flying allowing him to distinguish between routine radar surveillance and genuine missile guidance systems. His calm voiceover the intercom provided a steadying influence that helped Sarah maintain her focus amid the chaos of multiple simultaneous emergencies. The psychological pressure of the situation was almost as challenging as the technical demands of flying the damaged aircraft. Sarah found herself constantly second-guessing decisions that would have been automatic during her years as an active pilot, the intervening time as a nurse having eroded some of the confidence that was essential for effective crisis management. But gradually, as the flight progressed and she successfully navigated each new challenge, Sarah felt her pilot instincts reasserting themselves. The controls became extensions of her will rather than mechanical devices requiring conscious thought. The aircraft's responses became predictable rather than surprising. The chaos of multiple emergencies resolved into manageable tasks that could be prioritized and addressed systematically. Webb continued his heroic efforts to keep Harrison alive while managing the other medical emergencies in the cargo compartment. His voice remained calm and professional despite the magnitude of the challenges he was facing, providing status updates that allowed Sarah to understand the medical situation without becoming overwhelmed by details she couldn't control. The fuel situation remained critical, with consumption rates that left no margin for navigation errors or additional evasive maneuvers. Sarah found herself flying with a precision that eliminated all unnecessary course corrections, maintaining headings and altitudes that conserved every possible gallon of fuel while still avoiding known threat areas. As they entered the final third of their journey, new complications emerged that tested everyone's ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Intelligence reports indicated that Taliban forces had learned of their route and were positioning mobile missile systems along their projected flight path. The enemy was no longer reacting to their escape, but actively hunting them with sophisticated weapons and coordinated tactics. Sarah faced a decision that embodied the fundamental challenge of military aviation under combat conditions. She could maintain their current course, which offered the most direct route to safety but exposed them to known threats, or she could deviate to avoid enemy forces at the cost of additional fuel consumption that might leave them unable to reach their destination. The mathematics of the situation were unforgiving. Any significant course deviation would consume fuel reserves that were already marginal, potentially leaving them stranded over hostile territory with no options for emergency landing. But maintaining their current route virtually guaranteed engagement with enemy forces equipped with weapons capable of destroying their aircraft. Rodriguez provided tactical advice based on his combat experience, helping Sarah weigh the relative risks of each option. His knowledge of enemy capabilities and tactics proved invaluable as they developed a flight plan that balanced the need for threat avoidance against fuel conservation requirements. The decision they reached represented a compromise that satisfied neither safety nor efficiency concerns, but offered the best chance of reaching their destination with both aircraft and passengers intact. Sarah would maintain their general heading while making subtle course adjustments to avoid known threat concentrations, accepting the fuel penalty in exchange for reduced exposure to enemy weapons. As they implemented their modified flight plan, the aircraft's handling characteristics continued to deteriorate in ways that suggested multiple system failures. The left wing was now noticeably heavy, requiring constant control input to maintain level flight. The engines were showing signs of stress from operating at maximum power settings for extended periods, with oil temperatures and pressures that approached the limits of safe operation. Webb's medical reports became increasingly urgent as Harrison's condition continued to worsen. The combination of altitude, stress, and time was proving too much for his damaged cardiovascular system, creating a medical emergency that demanded immediate intervention at a level of care that could only be provided on the ground. Sarah found herself flying with a level of precision and determination that surprised even her own expectations. Every control input was calculated to extract maximum performance from the damaged aircraft while minimizing stress on both the mechanical systems and the medical equipment securing the wounded soldiers. She was flying not just with her hands, but with her entire being, channeling every lesson learned during years of training and experience. The radio communications with Bagram Air Base became increasingly frequent as they approached their destination. Ground controllers were coordinating emergency response assets, including medical personnel, fire and rescue equipment, and maintenance specialists who would be needed to assess the extent of their aircraft's damage. But even as rescue assets were being positioned for their arrival, new intelligence reports painted an increasingly grim picture of the threats that still lay ahead. Taliban forces had apparently concentrated their most sophisticated weapons along the final approach to Bagram, creating a gauntlet of surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery that would test Sarah's flying skills to their absolute limits. The prospect of executing an emergency approach through intense enemy fire while managing multiple medical emergencies and mechanical failures represented the kind of challenge that separated exceptional aviators from merely competent ones. Sarah would need to call upon every skill she had ever learned, every instinct she had ever developed, every lesson she had ever absorbed about flying under impossible conditions. Rodriguez made one final contribution to their survival by helping Sarah understand the specific threat environment they would face during their approach to Bagram. His knowledge of enemy tactics and weapons capabilities allowed them to develop an approach strategy that minimized their exposure while still maintaining the precision necessary for a safe landing. As they began their descent toward what might be either salvation or destruction, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 5 years ago, She had been stripped of her pilot qualifications and relegated to a supporting role that seemed to diminish everything she had worked to achieve. The authorities had decided she lacked the judgment and decision-making ability necessary for command of military aircraft. Now, with the lives of wounded soldiers, her medical team, and her flight crew depending entirely on her ability to fly them to safety, Sarah was about to provide the ultimate demonstration of whether that assessment had been correct. In the next 30 minutes, she would either prove that she deserved to be called a pilot, or she would provide a final confirmation of why her wings had been taken away. The approach to Bagram Air Base would require her to navigate through some of the most heavily defended airspace in the current theater of operations while managing an aircraft that was barely controllable and a medical situation that demanded constant attention. It was exactly the kind of impossible mission that had defined military aviation since the first combat pilot took to the skies over the battlefields of World War I. As enemy weapons began to track their descent and medical alarms sounded throughout the cargo compartment. Sarah Chen prepared to write the final chapter of a story that had begun 5 years earlier with failure and disgrace. Whether that chapter would end in triumph or tragedy remained to be determined by the next few minutes of flying. But Sarah knew that she would face whatever came with the skills, determination, and courage that had always defined her as an aviator. The mountain peaks of Afghanistan fell away beneath them as they descended toward an uncertain fate, their damaged aircraft carrying not just wounded soldiers, but the hopes and dreams of everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough, smart enough, or strong enough to achieve their goals. Sarah's hands gripped the controls with steady determination as she prepared to discover whether redemption was possible for someone who had fallen from grace and spent 5 years wondering if she would ever get a chance to prove herself again. Behind her, Webb continued his desperate fight to keep Harrison alive, while Rodriguez provided quiet encouragement despite his own pain and incapacitation. The wounded soldiers in the cargo compartment represented not just medical cases but living proof of the courage and sacrifice that defined military service at its best. As they entered the final phase of their approach, with enemy fire reaching up toward them from positions throughout the valley, Sarah realized that this moment represented more than just a test of her flying ability. It was a test of everything she believed about herself, everything she had learned during 5 years of exile from the cockpit, everything she hoped to achieve in whatever remained of her military career. The aircraft shuddered as anti-aircraft rounds exploded nearby, their fragments peppering the fuselage with metallic impacts that created new holes in an already damaged airframe. Sarah compensated with control inputs that had become automatic despite the years away from active flying, her muscle memory overriding conscious thought as she fought to maintain stable flight in increasingly hostile conditions. Bagram Air Base appeared ahead of them through the haze and smoke of combat, its runways and facilities representing safety for the wounded soldiers who had already sacrificed so much in service to their country. But between their current position and that sanctuary lay the most dangerous few minutes of flying that Sarah had ever attempted, a final test that would determine whether her story ended in triumph or became another tragedy in the long history of military aviation. The final approach to Bagram Air Base began with Sarah threading the damaged C-130 through a corridor of death that stretched for 15 miles across the Afghan valley floor. Taliban forces had positioned themselves with military precision along every ridge and elevation that offered clear fields of fire, turning the approach route into a carefully orchestrated killing zone designed to prevent exactly the kind of medical evacuation they were attempting. Sarah's eyes moved constantly between the instruments and the terrain ahead, calculating wind drift, fuel consumption, and descent rates while simultaneously monitoring the threat warning systems that screamed continuous alerts about missile guidance radars and anti-aircraft artillery. The aircraft was handling like a wounded bird, requiring constant control inputs to compensate for the fuel imbalance and structural damage that made normal flight characteristics impossible. Through her headset, she could hear the urgent coordination between Bagram Tower controllers and the fighter aircraft that had been scrambled to provide what protection they could. F-16 Fighting Falcons were already engaging surface-to-air missile sites with precision munitions, their pilots working to clear a path through the defensive network that stood between Sarah and safety. Behind her in the cargo compartment, Lieutenant Webb was fighting the most critical battle of his medical career. Colonel Harrison's condition had deteriorated to the point where only aggressive intervention was keeping him alive, his heart rhythm erratic and his blood pressure dangerously low despite maximum medication. The other wounded soldiers required constant attention, their injuries complicated by the stress of high-altitude flight and the violent maneuvering necessary to avoid enemy fire. Captain Rodriguez remained conscious but barely functional, his face drawn with pain despite the morphine that clouded his thinking. He continued to provide what assistance he could with navigation and communication, his voice weak but determined as he coordinated with approach controllers and relayed critical information about runway conditions and emergency response preparations. The fuel situation had become desperate, with consumption rates that left virtually no reserves for the kind of extended approach that might be necessary if their first landing attempt failed. Sarah was committed to a single approach and landing, with no opportunity for a second chance if something went wrong during the final moments of flight. As they descended through 8,000 feet, the first surface-to-air missile launched. From a concealed position near the base perimeter, Sarah saw the telltale flash of ignition and immediately threw the C-130 into a diving turn that stressed both the airframe and the medical equipment secured throughout the cargo bay. The missile passed close enough that she could see its exhaust trail through the side windows, a reminder of how thin the margin was between survival and catastrophe. The evasive maneuver cost them precious altitude and fuel while subjecting the wounded soldiers to G-forces that complicated their medical care. Sarah could hear equipment shifting in the cargo compartment, the sounds of medical personnel struggling to maintain patient care while dealing with the violent aircraft movements necessary for survival. A second missile launch prompted another desperate, evasive maneuver, this time a climbing turn that brought them dangerously close to stalling the overloaded aircraft. Sarah felt the controls going mushy as the C-130 approached its aerodynamic limits, the margin between controlled flight and unrecoverable departure growing thinner with each defensive maneuver. The threat warning system painted their aircraft with multiple radar signatures as enemy forces coordinated their attacks with increasing sophistication. Sarah realized that the Taliban had learned from previous medical evacuation attempts, developing tactics specifically designed to counter the defensive capabilities of transport aircraft operating in hostile environments. Rodriguez managed to assist with threat assessment despite his condition, his combat experience allowing him to distinguish between immediate dangers and routine surveillance radars. His calm voice over the intercom provided stability in the chaos of multiple simultaneous threats, helping Sarah prioritize her responses to maximize their chances of survival. Webb's voice cut through the tactical communications with increasingly urgent medical reports. Harrison was approaching cardiac arrest, his vital signs indicating that time was running out for any meaningful intervention. The other wounded soldiers were showing signs of shock and blood loss that demanded immediate surgical attention, making their race against time even more desperate. As they descended through 5,000 feet, anti-aircraft artillery joined the missile threat with streams of tracer fire that created deadly patterns across their flight path. Sarah found herself flying through gaps in the defensive fire that seemed impossibly narrow, the aircraft shuddering as fragments from nearby explosions peppered the fuselage. The left engine began showing signs of distress, its oil pressure dropping and temperature rising as damage from their combat takeoff finally began to manifest in mechanical failure. Sarah watched the engine parameters with growing concern, knowing that the loss of power from even one engine would make their already marginal approach impossible to complete. Bagram Tower controllers provided continuous updates on runway conditions and emergency response preparations, their voices reflecting the urgency of a situation that had captured the attention of the entire airbase. Medical personnel were standing by with trauma teams and cardiac specialists, while fire and rescue equipment was positioned to respond to whatever condition the aircraft might be in when it finally reached the ground. The approach lighting system appeared ahead through the haze of combat, offering the first visual confirmation that their destination was within reach. But the final 5 miles to the runway threshold represented the most heavily defended portion of their entire flight, with enemy forces concentrated in positions that offered overlapping fields of fire across the final approach corridor. Sarah began configuring the aircraft for landing while simultaneously dealing with the deteriorating engine and the constant threat of enemy fire. Each system activation had to be precisely timed to minimize the aircraft's vulnerability while ensuring that all critical components would be ready for the demanding landing ahead. The landing gear extended with mechanical groans that suggested damage to the hydraulic systems, the indicators showing that the wheels were down but possibly not fully locked in position. Sarah would have to land without certainty that the gear would support the aircraft's weight, adding another layer of risk to an already impossible situation. Rodriguez provided invaluable assistance with the landing checklist, despite his incapacitation, his memory of emergency procedures helping Sarah ensure that nothing critical was overlooked in the chaos of their approach. His knowledge of the aircraft systems proved essential as they dealt with multiple mechanical failures that threatened to cascade into catastrophic malfunction. The final 3 miles to the runway took them directly over enemy positions that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Surface-to-air missiles launched in rapid succession, forcing Sarah into a series of evasive maneuvers that brought the aircraft to the very edge of its performance envelope while maintaining the precise flight path necessary for a successful landing. Webb reported that Harrison had lost consciousness, his cardiac rhythm becoming increasingly erratic despite aggressive medical intervention. The combination of altitude, stress, and time was proving too much for his damaged cardiovascular system, creating a medical emergency that demanded immediate attention at a level only possible in a fully equipped trauma center. The runway threshold appeared ahead as Sarah fought to maintain control of an aircraft that was barely responding to her inputs. The left engine was running roughly, producing power in fits and starts that made precise flight control nearly impossible. The landing gear indicators showed amber rather than green, suggesting that the wheels might not be properly locked despite appearing to be in the down position. Anti-aircraft fire reached its crescendo as enemy forces made their final attempt to prevent the medical evacuation from succeeding. Tracer rounds created patterns of deadly light around the aircraft while explosive shells burst close enough to rock the C-130 with their concussive force. Sarah flew through the defensive fire with a combination of skill and determination that drew upon every lesson she had ever learned about aviation under combat conditions. The approach required her to balance multiple competing demands simultaneously. She needed to maintain precise airspeed and descent rate for a safe landing while executing defensive maneuvers to avoid enemy fire. The aircraft had to be configured properly for landing while compensating for mechanical failures that affected both control response and performance characteristics. As they crossed the runway threshold, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of transitioning from flight to landing, the moment when an aircraft committed itself to the ground, regardless of what obstacles might still lie ahead. The C-130 settled toward the runway with the heavy persistence of an overloaded transport, its damaged systems straining to provide the control authority necessary for a safe touchdown. The main landing gear contacted the concrete with a jarring, impact that sent vibrations throughout the airframe, the sound of metal and machinery absorbing forces that tested every component to its design limits. Sarah immediately applied reverse thrust and maximum braking, fighting to stop the aircraft before they ran out of runway or suffered a catastrophic gear failure. The left engine's rough running became more pronounced as reverse thrust increased. The stress on damaged components, but it continued to provide enough power to help with the landing rollout. Sarah could feel the aircraft pulling to the left as the asymmetric thrust and possible gear problems created handling challenges that required continuous correction to maintain directional control. Emergency vehicles were already racing toward their position as the C-130 rolled to a stop on the Bagram runway. Their crews prepared for everything from medical emergencies to aircraft fires. Sarah completed the engine shutdown procedures with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline, the reality of their survival finally beginning to register after hours of crisis management. Webb was already coordinating with the medical teams rushing toward the aircraft, his voice urgent but professional as he provided status reports on Harrison's condition and the other wounded soldiers who needed immediate trauma care. The cargo compartment erupted in controlled chaos as medical personnel began the process of transferring patients to advanced care facilities. Rodriguez managed a weak smile as he was helped from his crew position, his condition stabilized but still requiring significant medical attention. His gratitude was evident despite his pain. The understanding between aviators who had shared an impossible mission and somehow survived to tell about it. As Harrison was rushed toward the cardiac care unit, Sarah realized that their desperate flight had succeeded beyond what should have been possible. Every wounded soldier was alive. The aircraft had reached safety despite multiple system failures, and a mission that should have ended in tragedy had instead become a testament to the power of determination and skill under impossible circumstances. The debriefing that followed would reveal the full extent of their aircraft's damage and the medical challenges that had been overcome during their flight. Multiple structural components had been damaged by enemy fire, fuel systems had suffered. Significant leaks and engine problems had reached the point where continued operation would have been impossible. But the immediate aftermath was focused on medical care rather than technical analysis. Harrison was rushed into surgery where cardiac specialists worked to repair the damage caused by his heart attack, their efforts complicated by the altitude and stress he had endured during the flight. The other wounded soldiers received the trauma care that had been impossible to provide in the aircraft. Their survival depended on the speed with which Sarah had delivered them to advanced medical facilities. Colonel Patricia Hendricks, the base commander, arrived at the aircraft as Sarah completed her post-flight duties. Hendricks had spent 30 years in military aviation, rising through the ranks to command one of the most important air bases in the Afghan theater. Her expression reflected both relief at the successful mission and amazement at the circumstances that had made it possible. "Lieutenant Chen," Hendricks said, her voice carrying the authority of command tempered by genuine respect, "I need to understand exactly what happened out there. According to our records, you're a flight nurse, not a pilot." Sarah felt the familiar weight of explanation settling on her shoulders, the need to justify actions that had been driven by necessity rather than authority. "Yes, ma'am, I was a pilot before my reassignment to medical duties. When both Colonel Harrison and Captain Rodriguez became incapacitated, someone had to fly the aircraft." Hendricks studied Sarah's face with the intensity of someone who had spent decades evaluating military personnel. "Lieutenant, what you accomplished today goes far beyond simply flying an aircraft. You executed a combat mission under conditions that would challenge our most experienced pilots, while managing medical emergencies that would overwhelm most trauma centers. The investigation that followed would take weeks to complete, involving testimony from every crew member and analysis of every aspect of their mission." Sarah found herself at the center of attention that felt both validating and uncomfortable. recognition for abilities that she had been forced to suppress for 5 years. Rodriguez recovered sufficiently to provide detailed testimony about Sarah's performance during the crisis, his account painting a picture of exceptional skill and judgment under impossible pressure. Webb's medical reports documented the care provided to multiple critical patients while managing the stress of combat flight, a combination that demonstrated capabilities far beyond normal nursing duties. But the most significant testimony came from Colonel Harrison himself, who survived his cardiac emergency, to provide a first-hand account of Sarah's actions during the most critical moments of their flight. His recommendation carried the weight of 4 decades in military aviation, an endorsement that could not be dismissed by bureaucratic politics. The formal review board that convened to investigate the incident included senior officers from multiple commands, aviation safety specialists, and medical personnel qualified to evaluate the decisions made during the crisis. Their findings would determine not just whether Sarah's actions had been appropriate, but whether the circumstances warranted reconsideration of her status as a pilot. General Marcus Thompson, the theater commander, personally reviewed the case file and interview transcripts. Thompson had built his reputation on identifying and developing exceptional military talent, regardless of the bureaucratic obstacles that might stand in the way. His decision would determine whether Sarah's heroic actions would be recognized or dismissed as an unfortunate deviation from proper procedures. The final hearing took place 6 weeks after their return to Bagram, in a conference room that had hosted countless military justice proceedings over the years. Sarah sat at the witness table in her dress uniform, the ribbons and decorations reflecting years of service that had included both triumph and disgrace. General Thompson addressed the assembled board with the gravity appropriate to a proceeding that would determine the future of an officer whose actions had saved multiple lives under extraordinary circumstances. We are here to evaluate the performance of Lieutenant Sarah Chen during a medical evacuation mission that became one of the most challenging aviation operations in recent memory. The presentation of evidence took most of the day, with testimony from crew members, medical personnel, and aviation experts who had analyzed every aspect of their flight. The technical details painted a picture of exceptional flying under conditions that had pushed both aircraft and crew to their absolute limits. Rodriguez provided the most compelling testimony, his detailed account of Sarah's decision-making and aircraft handling leaving no doubt about her qualifications as a pilot. Lieutenant Chen didn't just fly the aircraft, he stated. She commanded the mission with the skill and judgment of a senior aviator, making decisions that saved all our lives. Webb's testimony focused on the medical aspects of the mission, documenting how Sarah had managed multiple patient care emergencies while simultaneously handling the demands of combat flying. His account demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond what could reasonably be expected from either a nurse or a pilot operating independently. Harrison's appearance before the board carried special weight, given his reputation and the fact that he owed his life to Sarah's actions. Despite still recovering from his cardiac surgery, he insisted on providing testimony that would influence the board's final decision. Lieutenant Chen saved my life twice during that mission, Harrison stated with quiet conviction. Once as a nurse who recognized my medical emergency and provided appropriate care, and once as a pilot who flew us to safety when no one else could. She demonstrated the kind of exceptional ability that the Air Force should recognize and develop, not suppress. The board's deliberation took 3 days, during which Sarah remained in administrative limbo while her future was decided by officers who had never flown the kind of mission she had completed. The uncertainty was almost worse than the original crisis, offering time to contemplate all the ways her actions might be interpreted by people who valued procedure over results. General Thompson announced the board's decision in the same conference room where the hearing had taken place, his expression revealing nothing about the conclusions that had been reached. Sarah stood at attention as he prepared to deliver findings. That would determine whether her career would continue or end with this final demonstration of her capabilities. "Lieutenant Chen," Thompson began, his voice carrying the formality appropriate to such proceedings. "This board has concluded that your actions during the medical evacuation mission of 6 weeks ago were not only appropriate under the circumstances, but represented exceptional performance that reflects credit upon yourself and the United States Air Force." Sarah felt relief flood through her system, but Thompson was not finished with his statement. "Furthermore, this board has determined that your previous removal from pilot status was based on incomplete information and flawed judgment. Effective immediately, you are hereby restored to pilot status with the rank of captain, and you are assigned to command the newly formed Medical Aviation Emergency Response Unit." The transformation from disgraced former pilot to unit commander happened with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized military personnel actions, but the personal impact would take much longer to fully absorb. Sarah found herself not just vindicated, but placed in a position of responsibility that exceeded anything she had achieved before her fall from grace. The Medical Aviation Emergency Response Unit would specialize in exactly the kind of mission they had just completed, combining advanced pilot training with medical expertise to handle evacuations under combat conditions. Sarah would have the opportunity to develop tactics and procedures that could save countless lives in future operations. Rodriguez volunteered to serve as her deputy commander once his medical recovery was complete, their shared experience creating a professional bond that would prove invaluable in developing the new unit. Webb requested assignment as the senior medical officer, his own performance during the crisis having demonstrated capabilities that warranted expanded responsibilities. Colonel Harrison returned to duty with a new appreciation for the intersection of medical and aviation skills, becoming one of the strongest advocates for the integration of advanced medical training into pilot education programs. His support provided institutional backing that would prove essential as Sarah worked to establish her new command. The aircraft that had carried them through their impossible mission was repaired and returned to service, its maintenance records noting the extensive damage that had been sustained during their flight. The fact that it had remained airworthy despite multiple system failures became part of the legend that grew around their survival. Sarah's first official act as unit commander was to establish training standards that would ensure future crews could handle similar emergencies with the same level of competence they had demonstrated. The combination of pilot skills and medical knowledge required months of intensive training, but the results would justify the investment when the next impossible mission arose. The story of their flight became required reading at the Air Force Academy, where it served as an example of how exceptional individuals could overcome seemingly impossible circumstances through skill, determination, and the courage to act when action was needed. Sarah found herself invited to speak at military institutions around the world, sharing lessons learned from a mission that redefined what was possible in military aviation. But perhaps the most significant outcome was personal rather than professional. Sarah had discovered that her identity as a pilot was more than just a job or even a calling. It was an essential part of who she was as a person. The 5 years of exile had not diminished her abilities, but had instead prepared her for a level of responsibility that required both technical excellence and the wisdom that came from experiencing failure and redemption. As she stood on the tarmac at Bagram, watching her newly formed unit conduct training exercises, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had been stripped of her wings 5 years earlier had been competent and confident, but she had lacked the depth of understanding that came from serving in different roles and facing genuine adversity. The nurse who had been forced to abandon her dreams had learned lessons about medical care, human psychology, and institutional politics that no amount of flight training could have provided. Those lessons had proven essential when crisis demanded decisions that went far beyond simple aviation skills. The pilot who now commanded her own unit possessed capabilities that neither of her previous selves could have achieved independently. She understood medicine well enough to make life and death decisions about patient care, politics well enough to navigate institutional resistance to change, and aviation well enough to fly impossible missions under conditions that would ground most aircraft. 6 months later, when another impossible medical evacuation presented itself in a different theater of operations, Sarah's unit responded with capabilities that had been developed through the integration of lessons learned from their original mission. The success of that operation, and the many that followed, provided vindication not just for Sarah's individual actions, but for the concept of combining medical and aviation expertise at the highest levels. The wounded soldiers who had been saved during their original flight remained in contact with Sarah and her crew, their gratitude serving as a constant reminder of why military service mattered, beyond personal advancement or professional recognition. Their survival had depended on the willingness of military personnel to risk everything for the mission, regardless of personal cost or institutional politics. Rodriguez continued to serve as Sarah's deputy, their partnership evolving into one of the most effective command teams in military aviation. His experience as a former fighter pilot, combined with her medical background, created a leadership dynamic that could handle both the technical and human aspects of their demanding missions. Webb became one of the Air Force's leading experts on aeromedical emergency procedures, his experience during their crisis flight providing the foundation for training programs that would save countless lives in future operations. His calm competence under pressure proved to be exactly the kind of skill that could be developed and transferred to other medical personnel. Harrison returned to flight status after his cardiac recovery, becoming an advocate for the kind of integrated training that Sarah's unit represented. His endorsement carried weight throughout the aviation community, helping to overcome institutional resistance to changes that challenged traditional boundaries between medical and pilot specialties. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.